Welcome to the Stewardship Sessions, the podcast where money meets meaning. Here, we talk about building wealth with wisdom, shaping a mindset rooted in purpose, and pursuing a mission guided by faith. I'm your host, Jason Stanley, and together we'll explore intentional living, one conversation at a time. All right, welcome back. So in the last episode, I kind of hinted at this idea of building net worth versus having a ton of cash on hand and that kind of stuff. But I do want to clarify that, because I'll start by asking this question. Would you rather have, 20 million in net worth with only $50,000 cash on hand? Or would you rather have $2 million net worth with $1 million liquid? And I think the answer is based on the individual. And I'll tell you how I've done it in my life. In the early years of building out my business and building out my life, I was very focused on net worth. I was very focused on going out and buying assets. And net worth is anything that you have that's an asset that is appreciating in value, right? That's where your net worth starts to come in. It's the things that you own, right? And then a lot of times they're not very liquid. And my goal has been never to have to sell an asset. Now, I define an asset in my life by anything that's creating wealth for me or creating cash flow for me. And so if it's doing both of those, it's even better. And I don't ever really want to have to sell those. If I do have to liquidate something like a stock position or a real estate investment or something like that, I want something else that takes its place. I don't want to just take that cash back in and go spend it, right? But I also started doing something else a couple of years ago. I started building a liquidity pool. Now, liquidity pool isn't as flashy as having assets. It's not going to grow as much, but it's a pool of money that's basically put into something that's just got nominal growth to it, right? But it's stable, as stable as it can be, and I'm not risking that capital. And the reason that I'm building that liquidity pool, the reason that I started building that up and still continue to build the asset is because a lot of times when you have large net worth, you can struggle to write, a $10,000 check or a $20,000 check. You can struggle for those things. And sometimes it puts you in a position where you're, trying to negotiate out a deal or something like that, but you really can't tap into that net worth all the time as easy as you can grab the cash that you have on hand. So I would say that there's not one way to do this. It's two different strategies built out together. But I think in the early years of your life and as you get started and growing, focusing on building your net worth is a really important thing. And you can see a lot of videos, a lot of people talk about how to leverage your net worth, and that means borrow money against your net worth to go buy other assets, that kind of stuff. And I'm not necessarily advocating for that. I'll tell you, I think that there's a time and place for it, but you have to be really smart in how you do it, because there are, history is wrought with people who over leverage their assets and end up losing everything. Dave Ramsey's a really great example of this. Dave was doing real estate investments in the 80s, and I believe it was around the time of the savings and loan crisis in the 80s that all of a sudden all his loans started getting called, and he kept borrowing money to go buy other real estate. At least this is how I understand it. And Dave, if you ever watch this, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But what ended up happening was he was in a position where he was over leveraged to be able to go buy any more homes, and they started to call his loans, and when they called his loans, he didn't have the money to pay them. So I think it's important to build net worth, but I think it's important to build net worth and understand that takes a little while to do, and it takes a lot of patience to watch that grow and to continue to build it. And maybe there is a point in time where it might make sense to leverage a piece of it, right? But again, it needs to be done in a very smart, thought out way so that you're not just going and buying, you're not trying to, blast your net worth straight up. You're slowly, systematically building that net worth over time. And then have a goal in mind. Have a point in time where you shift and you also start building your liquidity pool. You always need some liquidity, because what liquidity allows you to do is to go take advantage of new opportunities and that type of thing. And so I split my money in two ways. I build a liquidity pool and I build net worth, and so I have a goal right now to grow my liquidity pool to a certain level. And then refocus on growing my net worth. So I kind of grow the net worth first, build up the liquidity pool, of what I need to be comfortable so that I can go take advantage of stuff, because I really don't want to have to borrow money. I don't want to have to borrow it from the bank. I don't want to have to go out and take out loans on stuff. So I want to be able to go take down new assets and continue to build that net worth without having to put myself into debt to do it. And one of the reasons I say sometimes it's more important to focus on growing net worth than it is on your cash on hand is because most people don't have their net worth is really tied up in their personal home, which I don't generally classify your personal residence as an asset. I look at that more as a liability, because while you're there, it costs you money and that type of thing. If you look at the inflation adjusted appreciation on homes, it's not very high, and I'll let you run the numbers on it. You can put it into AI, you can Google it, whatever you want to do. It's not really all that high, but, and I'm not saying that home ownership is bad. I'm just saying that, I view my personal residence as a liability, right? So my other investment properties, rental properties, things like that I have, other business ventures that I have, that's where my net worth sits. So my net worth sits in my business. It sits in my, investment real estate. It sits in my stock portfolio and that kind of stuff. And I constantly want to be growing that, but I also don't want to liquidate that. Those are things that I want to hold long term and let them continue to grow and compound. And then building out the liquidity pool on the other side, so that I have more liquid, assets that I can grab to go buy other longer term assets that increase my net worth. And so as you start thinking about how you build out wealth, this is the process that I have found that is most useful for me. And there's no direct scientific method to which you go do this, right? There's no right or wrong answer on how to build wealth, but you have to be consistent with it. You have to be consistent with how you're focused on things. And one of the reasons I don't want to have to sell assets is because I don't want to have to deal with the tax implications of them, right? And yes, there comes a point in time where, you can leverage a piece, a very small piece of an asset, maybe to help you go do something else. But if I'm growing my net worth, right, that gives me a lot more flexibility to go do other things should I need to. And simultaneously, if I'm growing my liquidity pool, that gives me the ability to go buy more assets, and now my net worth grows even faster. And so again, like I said in the last episode, I think of money very simply as soldiers on a battlefield. And I can take, those soldiers that I get and compensation that I receive for the services that I provide, and I can either go spend those, and in those terms, I say I'm killing those soldiers on the battlefield, or I can go put them to work and let them build an army for me. But you need both. I'm a big fan of what Dave Ramsey talks about in terms of building, an emergency fund. I call it a liquidity pool. It's not really an emergency fund for me because I've got enough liquidity that, there's really nothing that I operate or anything that I have in my life that would create a really big emergency in my life. And so one of the cool things about creating a liquidity pool and then going out and buying assets and then using the cash flow off that to continue to build the liquidity pool is now you have both sides growing together. And as you do that, you have a lot more flexibility. You're not put in a position when you're negotiating a deal or something from a position where you don't have a choice about something. You have a lot more leverage, you have a lot more choice on how you get things accomplished. And so I think both of those are really, really the key. But early on, I would say focus on growing your net worth. You have money coming in, have your emergency fund that's set aside so that if something does go wrong, you've got at least enough money to cover it. But focus on growing that net worth, because that net worth starts to compound. It compounds very quickly over time. So when you look at people like Elon Musk, who's worth $1 trillion, he very rarely has that much money in the bank. There's some varying reports on that and that kind of stuff, but he doesn't have $1 trillion sitting in the bank. His net worth is $1 trillion. So he has to take the money, he has to go borrow money a lot in order to do what he wants to be able to do. I'll give you an example. When he wanted to buy X, he had to put up Tesla stock and go borrow that money and, go buy X and then be able to use the cash flow of X to take care of that debt. Now, if X goes under, he'll lose that Tesla stock to his investors, right? And so you don't want to be in that position either. You don't want to be in the position where you're going to lose an asset because you decided to leverage it. And I think that's one of the traps that a lot of people fall into is they go, all right, I could go buy a rental property, and they get it paid down and they immediately go take out another loan to go buy another property. Now they got a loan on 2 properties. And they don't have the cash flow necessarily to service the debt on both. They're just hoping that they can get it rented out and that it'll take care of itself. And that starts to become a really slippery slope. And at some point in time, that house of cards will fall, And so as you start to think about, as you sit down with family and you start talking about how to build net worth and how to build liquidity pool, I think one of the really important things is to come up with rules that you have written down that you stick to, because a lot of times emotion can take hold and you can want to try to leapfrog into a better position, but you can also put yourself in a worse position at the same time, especially when you get into leveraging assets. So if I have to borrow money to buy an asset, I'm not going to borrow anything on that asset until I have paid off everything. But I also want to make sure that I have the cash flow and such to be able to service that completely 100% on my own. If I can't do that, then I'm not going to go buy that asset. So again, building both, I think, is very important as you start to build net worth and you start to build up that liquidity pool. And one of the most important things that I think you can start doing with your family now is talk about how you would go about building net worth, why it's important. Talk about the importance of building up that emergency fund, that a liquidity pool, so that you can go buy other assets. And when you do that together, again, like I said before, you start covering more ground. You're able to actually build a little bit faster. But it doesn't take long until you do hit that point of critical momentum where your net worth starts to grow at a very rapid compounded rate of return. And, on paper, you're worth quite a bit. And that gives you a lot better position to negotiate from when we're talking about working with banks. It gives you a lot better position to negotiate from when we're talking about other business deals and that type of thing. But your liquidities is equally important. So having liquidity helps you be able to, be able to operate without having to take down a lot of debt to be able to grow those assets. There is the thought process out there. There's a lot of videos on, always borrowing against your assets and all that stuff and always using debt. And I would say that I think it's a balancing act, and I think you have to be very, very careful with it. And one of the reasons that I believe people like Dave Ramsey encourage people not to use debt at all is because most people can't be disciplined enough to avoid the traps that come with that. And so, my advice is, in as much as you can, learn how to buy what you need with the cash that you have on hand. But if you're talking about building out businesses, if you're talking about that kind of stuff, there's times that it's not going to be possible not to take on any debt. Sometimes you have to do that in order to be able to grow a business. Sometimes you have to be able to do that in order to buy your first property or something like that. But have a good plan in place that, and make sure that you have the ability to service that, even if that asset doesn't turn out the way you thought it was going to, because you're not going to make all the right decisions. Once your net worth grows, there comes a point in time where you can weather a bad storm, you can weather a bad decision a lot easier than when you're first starting off. And so when you're first starting off, I think it's really, really important to make sure that you have liquidity first, and then start building out investments second. And so once you start building those investments, letting them sit there and just compound over time, and splitting your money between the two, and then you can take some out of your liquidity pool, go buy other assets, that kind of stuff. It doesn't sound exciting. This isn't a get rich fast, plan. This isn't, you're going to become a millionaire overnight, that kind of thing. This is about doing small things regularly. But you will hit a point, and there's a great talk that Charlie Munger did on, getting to your first 100,000 invested, and all of a sudden you see your net worth start growing, and you actually start seeing good returns. Because when we talk about even a 10% return on your investments, which is fairly good. That's what the market's done, I think, over the past 10 years, 15 years, something like that. If you talk about that on $1,000, that's not a lot of money. If you talk about that on, 10,000, it's still not a lot of money. On 100,000, it starts to become a little bit more. And then, especially as you grow it up to, 500,000 or $1 million, now 10% is actually quite a bit of money, and you can sit there and watch that net worth compound. And again, it's not about how much can you accumulate. It's how do you balance the two together? Because you still have to be able to live life. You still have to be able to pay your bills. You still have to be able to take care of any debt service that you have. And you still have to be able to take care of any emergencies that come up. And so, I've found there have been times in my life where I've made the mistake of only having net worth but no cash on hand. And then there's other times, where I had them pretty well balanced out. And so in the times that I had only net worth but not a lot of cash on hand, it was very hard, because on paper I was worth a lot, but I didn't have the money to go do things that I wanted to be able to go do. I didn't have money to go continue to build that. So I had to focus on building up that liquidity pool. And, once I got that built up, I was able to go buy more assets, build up more net worth, and that type of thing. And so I would say, as much as you can, balancing those things out. But you need to be mindful of it. You need to be mindful of how much you're putting in your liquidity pool versus you're putting in your net worth pool, as we'll call it, because your net worth should be growing a lot faster than your liquidity pool. And if all you have is liquidity, but you're not earning anything on it, you're losing money. You're losing purchasing power with that money. And so you need to be smart about that as well. Money and finance is not about this harsh set of rules. It's about doing things consistently over time and letting things compound. And if you do that smart and you do that in a wise way, you'll be surprised at where you end up. But it takes being diligent. Most people will get to that first 100,000 and then they'll either take the money out, they'll borrow money against it or something like that. Market drops, they get a margin call, and they end up losing it, right? Or they just get to a point where they just want to go spend it. They go spend it, and then now they're starting back over at zero. So I would say being disciplined and focus on building net worth and, writing out that goal of how you want to build net worth, right? What is it that you want to do? And one of the easiest ways to start is just by investing in the market. A lot of people think that the market is a scary place. It's not. It's got a lot of good businesses in it. And if history has shown us anything, the market continues to grow over time. So if the market goes to zero, I got news for you. Everything that you have asset-wise is going to go to zero too, as well as your liquidity pool. So it doesn't really matter. And so that's a pretty low probability event. So don't think in those types of terms. A lot of people have this hyperbolic thinking around, well, what if the market crashes, that kind of thing. What I would tell you is just be diligent. Don't worry about what the market does day to day or even year over year. Just be diligent with what you're putting away. Real estate's the same thing. Real estate fluctuates as well. And people don't realize that sometimes because they can touch it, they can feel it, it's tangible to them. So it's not that there's one just good way to go build net worth. It's being consistent in a lot of different areas. But at the same time, you have to start building that cash on hand so that you can take advantage of opportunities as they come to you. And when you have a good liquidity pool and you have a really strong, cash position, you're able to jump on those. We'll use Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company, as an example. Berkshire sits on a pile of cash almost at all times, right? They've got a massive net worth, but they also have this really big pile of cash. And you can say, well, yeah, that's easy for them. They're worth billions. Yes, that's true. They're worth billions. But a lot of companies never get to that point. They have a lot of net worth. A lot of individuals never get to that point. They have a lot of net worth, but they don't ever have cash on hand. And Buffett was smart enough to realize early on that if he built up his cash on hand alongside the net worth of his company, then when opportunities came along, he could just go take down whatever asset he wanted. And that's how he was able to compound the returns on Berkshire Hathaway so well. And because he saw when everybody else was scared, he would start going and buying. In 2009, he took a $5 billion stake, I believe it was, in Goldman Sachs. He put some other money to work and stuff like that. And he was able to go do that because he had that cash on hand. He didn't have to worry about going to the bank and borrowing the money. He didn't have to leverage Berkshire Hathaway to go do it. He just had the cash there to go do it. Now, that's a lot of money to have in cash, right? And most of us would be ecstatic to have that, But it's a very practical way to look at things and how you think about your own life, So as you start building up that net worth, also focus on building up your liquidity so that you can take advantage of opportunities as they come up, because some of the best times to buy is when everybody else is scared. I don't care if it's real estate, I don't care if it's stock investments, whatever it is. A lot of times the best time to be buying stuff is when everybody else is in a panic and they're selling things. I think it was J.D. Rockefeller who said, when there's blood in the street, that's the time to start making money, right? And he was saying, when everybody else is panicked, when everything seems to be falling apart, that's where the opportunities lie. And so, thinking through those things and start developing out your plan for yourself, for your family, of how you're going to build both your net worth and your liquidity, right? How do you build that up? And you can do that. You don't have to make a ton of money to do this. I know teachers that have more net worth than some people that make $1 million to $1.5 million a year. And they have more liquidity. So again, the only thing they've done is been very diligent about how they're deploying their money and how they look at things, and we have this idea a lot of times that in order to have more, we should make more first. And I would say start being diligent in the small things now, and you'll get to where more is coming in, and so that's how I've done things in my life, and I found that to work very well. I've made mistakes along the way. I've made some bad investments along the way. I've lost money and that kind of stuff. But the nice thing about the position that I'm in is even when I've made a bad investment and it hasn't worked out like I thought it would, it's not a catastrophic loss because I'm not over leveraged. I'm not, trying to go to the bank to borrow, and I've still got liquidity on this side that helps be able to pad that time period so I can unwind that investment. So again, this is all built around the idea that you start working with your family now, you start working on yourself now and doing these compounded things over time, and suddenly they grow very large. And it'll feel like you're pushing a boulder up a hill in the beginning. And then all of a sudden you're going to get to a point where you're running just to try to keep up with that boulder, because it will start to compound, it will start to grow so rapidly. But having good goals, having good plans, having good written rules for how you deploy money, what you do with your money, right, is really important. So, and like I've said before, I'm a big proponent of giving, of tithing and stuff. And so as soon as I have money come in, 10% immediately goes to tithe, 10% immediately goes into investments, and then I take another percentage and start putting it in my liquidity pool, and then I have the percentage that I live on, right? And so I'm continuing to build both of those over time. And, I teach my kids about this. We're together about this on a family basis, and we're looking at new opportunities that we can go do together. And so I believe that over time, we'll be able to continue to grow that, and our family will thrive because of it for multiple generations, as long as we continue to do things diligently and we're consistent with our activities. And so again, wealth building it's not rocket science. It's not hard. There's so many things out there today about, if you do this, you're going to get rich. If you do that, you're going to get rich. Rich is really whatever you define it as. So I would say sit down and define what that means for you. Define what that means for you to build wealth, and then how you're going to impact the world around you, and then how you're going to incorporate and teach your kids and teach your family how to do that together. And so when you start doing that together, it grows even faster. So that's all I got for you this time. Hope it makes sense. And stay tuned. We got more coming.